Okay, good morning, everyone. Happy Monday. Hope you had a good weekend. Let's see who's here. Cindy's here. Good morning, Cindy. Shaffan's here. Good morning, Shaffan. Good morning, Lily. Good morning, Aliana. Good evening, Thika again. Good morning, Casey. Good morning, Adalbert. Hello again, Karen. Um, who else? Who else is here? Who else is here? Manish is here and Mashid is here. Good morning to both of you. Mashid, good morning again. Who else? Who else? Who else? Jimmy's here. Good morning, Jimmy. Good morning, Pearly. So, as people continue to trickle in, good morning, Michael. As people continue to trickle in, so what we'll do very quickly is we'll just review what we talked about with China and kind of just tie up that loose end, and then we'll move on to our next culture, which is Greece, which I think should be interesting. Good morning, Ying. Okay, let's do it. Let's jump in. So, on Friday, I asked you to try and come up with a bit of some summary information about all of these kind of broad topics within what am I trying to say? Broad topics that we studied within the sort of realm of China, of ancient China. And a couple things that I think we noted, and I hope I captured all the things that we talked about. But we said that China had a very diverse geography and climate, right? China is a large country, and so China has mountains, particularly to the south and to the west. It has deserts, of course, to the north. There are sort of more tropical rainforests in the south and in the places where China borders Southeast Asia. But then there's also some steppe regions, some open grassland regions to the west. And so the north part of China tends to be a little bit drier and a little bit cooler. The south part of China tends to be a little bit warmer and a little bit wetter. But so depending on where you live in China, you might be living in quite a different environment. We said that there were two major river systems, the Yellow and the Yangtze, and both of those, good morning, Min, both of those rivers were important to the development of Chinese civilization, right? They provided sort of a steady source of water to irrigate crops and sort of a flat floodplain that people were able to grow crops on as well. And so good morning, Carmen. We saw that happen in many civilizations so far, that river systems are the places where people tend to farm, they tend to practice intensive agriculture, and that's where more complex civilizations tend to pop up, right? Good morning, Jenna. In terms of power and authority and governance, we said that China was pretty interesting because it had been under dynastic rule for most of its 4,000 year history. And so this is a very long history that sort of moves from dynasty to dynasty. And of course, a dynasty is a succession of hereditary kings. There are periods in between sometimes where there's some civil war, particularly the Warring States period that we talked about. But most of the time it is China is under the rule of one person, either a king or an emperor, and those different areas of China are brought under control by military conquest, right? So kings fight against each other until one king is able to dominate the entire area, and that's kind of the story of what's happening. We learned a little bit about Zhou kinship feudalism, right, which was sort of an early form of, I guess, a very early form of administering an empire, but it called for power to be decentralized. And so there were all those nobles that were out in the countryside running different parts of China. But we found that even though it worked well at the beginning, ultimately it kind of fell apart. And so that idea was replaced by legalism, right? So in the late Zhou period, this guy Shen Yang came up with this concept of legalism, allowing the emperor to maintain power over the people through a series of laws, right? And so The Qin dynasty kind of inherited that legalism, and then the Han dynasty partially used it as well. We said that legalism under the Qin was kind of a system of laws with very sort of strong punishments for crimes, but that law code applied equally to all people. But a little bit later, under the Han, we saw that the ideas of Confucius were the ones that were worked into how people administered the state and how they expected people to behave as citizens. And then we also heard about that idea of the mandate of heaven, right, which was used to justify why certain kings or certain dynasties had power over the people, and why the last dynasty was no longer in power, right? So it was an idea. Hello, Ella. The idea of the mandate of heaven was a justification for who was in power. For interactions and exchanges, we said that there was probably lots of trade between the major civilizations of the ancient world, and so China was connected to India, and India was connected to Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia was also connected to China via the Silk Road, and we said that the Silk Road, even though it existed before the Han Empire, it became more trade was engaged in during that period because the Han set up military garrisons to protect that Silk Road. And so because it was more safe, people started to travel it more, people started to trade more, and of course that was economically beneficial for China and the Han dynasty. There was also some interactions between dynasties, right? We said that Confucius was inspired by the kings of the early Zhou period. We said that the Han were inspired by Confucius and used his ideas in their empire. The Qin and the Han dynasty inherited this concept of legalism from the late Zhou period. And of course, this mandate of heaven idea comes from the Shang dynasty, which is either the first or second dynasty in Chinese history, but it continues to be used all the way through. For conflicts, well, we saw lots of war, lots of military campaigns. Good morning, Lynn. Lots of military campaigns. The Zhou created a unified China after they overthrew the Shang dynasty. There was a warring states period after the late Zhou. There was a civil war after the fall of the Qin, which led to the Han dynasty. And so lots of war within China between rulers and between kingdoms, but not very many conflicts in which China was involved in conflict with the outside world. Most of the conflict we saw was sort of within China, and in part that has to do with the period that we're in. There still aren't very many civilizations that appear at this time in history. In part it has to do with geography though as well. The Chinese civilizations that occur are kind of way out in the east, right? They're separated. They're a long distance from the Indian empires. They're a very long distance from the Mesopotamian and the Persian empires. But these Chinese civilizations are also protected by geography, right? So again, to the north of China, there were simple herders or pastoralists, so not really a threat to Chinese civilization, although later they will be. There's no major states in Southeast Asia at the time. The Himalayan mountains are kind of a barrier between India and China. And again, if you look west of China, there are no major states either. You have to go a long way before you bump into the Persian Empire. So China is kind of relatively left to its own devices in the period that we studied, and so most of the conflict we see happens within China. We saw the balance of two universal forces for values and beliefs, the dragon and the phoenix, and that humans are meant to sort of keep the balance. We talked about Confucius, of course, and his reimagining of lessons from the late Zhou into a philosophical and a moral system based on humanity and filial piety and so on. We talked about Taoism, right? The Tao is this invisible way, this invisible force of the universe, and so the Taoists believe that people should live in alignment with the Tao. And then we saw a bunch of cultural expressions too, and we said in some of the videos we saw music, we saw some dance, we saw some Chinese, ancient Chinese and imperial Chinese fashion. We saw some sculpture in bronze and in wood and in stone. We saw those terracotta soldiers that the Qin emperor had buried with him. We saw some writing, and of course Confucianism as well, right, as a philosophicalism and moral system. Yeah, so that's kind of what we saw with China. Okay, let's move on. Let's leave China behind here, sadly, and let's move on to Greece. So Greece is an important civilization because, sorry, I'm just going to turn on a light here. Greece is an important civilization, particularly for the Western world. If you're familiar with influencers on Instagram, people who put their content out there and everybody kind of pays attention to what they do and sort of copies them a little bit. The Greek world, the Greeks are heavy influencers of the ancient world. They're kind of a small area. They are not unified in any way for the most part, but they have a major effect on the civilizations around them. They interact with the Persian Empire in a couple of instances. They have a heavy influence on the Romans, and they have a heavy influence on Western civilization as well, because through the Romans, people will continue to be inspired by Greek art, Greek architecture, science, philosophy, and so we'll see Greek ideas sort of permeate throughout the Western world, again, through the Roman Empire, through the Renaissance, through the Enlightenment, through the creation of the United States. The United States is heavily influenced by Rome, which is heavily influenced by Greece. And so Greece is very interesting because they're this small little area of the ancient world. Most of the major things that happen in Greece happen in a very short time period, but they have a major effect on the Western world hundreds and thousands of years later. So, you know, the Greeks can be thought of as pretty significant influencers in the ancient world, even though, again, they're not super powerful, and a lot of the developments that happen in Greece happen in a very short time period. It's pretty interesting. So I asked you these questions. So now I'm going to ask them. Now I'm going to ask them to you. So let's start off with this one. What is a polis? What's a polis? So Cindy, you're always so quick on the trigger there, Cindy. It's very impressive. Cindy says a polis is an independent city-state, okay, which consisted of a walled city that controlled and protected the farmland around it. Yes, and so in that respect, Greek city-states, Greek polises, or polis, as they're called in plural, Greek polis are very similar to Mesopotamian city-states, right? When we looked back at Mesopotamia and ancient Sumeria, we said the same thing, that city-states were walled urban centers that controlled the area around them. And so a Greek polis is very similar that way as well. Aliana says yes. Okay, same thing. Good. Casey says an independent city-state. This is an important thing as well. So it's a walled city. The polis is a walled city, controls the area around it, but these polis, each polis is interesting because they're all kind of a little bit different. They're all kind of unique. they all these different polis kind of appear on their own, and they organize themselves the way that they choose to. And so each polis is kind of a unique creature in terms of its kind of culture, in terms of its kind of approach to life, in terms of its economy, and in terms of its political organization. And so we'll see that a little bit. We're not going to look, there's many polis throughout the Greek world. For the most part, we're just going to look at Athens and Sparta. But even Athens and Sparta are pretty wildly different places to live. But we'll talk about that as we go forward. So they're all the city-states, all these polis are independent. They have their own form of government. They have their own laws, their own army, and their own unique culture. Okay, and so living in, if you're living in the ancient world, if you're living in ancient Greece, living in Athens is a very different experience than living in Sparta, or living in Corinth, or living in Argos, or living in Delos, or wherever. Okay. Pearlie says it's the basic unit of organization in this period. Yep. So this is how the Greeks politically organize themselves. So not into a kingdom, not into an empire, not into states, but into polis, into city-states. Cindy also says each of these possesses its own form of government, good, and law, code, and army, good, and cult of patron gods. Yeah, so each sorry, I've just got stuff in my eyes here. Each city-state has its own patron god, a god that looks after the city. And so in Athens, for instance, it's Athena, right? That's where Athens gets its name from, Athena, the god of wisdom. But other city-states worship other gods, right? So Sparta's patron god is Ares, the god of war. So they all have their own patron gods and their overall culture that sets them apart from others. Yes, patron gods, good, Karen. They're all independent, yes. I'm not sure that's quite right there, Jimmy, but that's okay. So each polis is a unique little city-state. It's independent of all the other city-states, and again, they're all unique animals, right? They all have a different character, a different culture, a different political organization, a different patron god. And so living in one Greek city-state, living in one polis, is really a different experience from living in another polis. Okay. So that brings us to geography. What is Greece's geography like? Because the landscape of Greece is very important in terms of how its history plays out. So if you remember Egypt, for instance, Egypt's geography was very important to it as well, right? Because Egypt is all desert except for that one, the river, the Nile River that runs through it, and the sort of green farmland around it. And so the Egyptians had to practice intensive agriculture because of that, but the river was also very beneficial to their crops and to developing a civilization. But also, because Egypt was surrounded by desert, it was very difficult to get to, and so people Egypt didn't have to deal with foreign invaders for quite some time because they were protected by the desert. So Egypt's geography was very important in its development, and in a similar way, Greece's geography is important to its development as well. So Cindy says extending as far as Italy in the west and the territories of modern-day Turkey and Ukraine in the east. Yes. So one thing we need to remember about the Greek world is that the Greek world in the past is different from the Greece we know today, right? Greece as a country is just that one kind of peninsula, right? Just that one area. But in the ancient world, the Greek world was actually quite a bit larger, right? So there were Greek city-states all throughout the Aegean and the Mediterranean, and so The Greek world of ancient times was actually quite a bit wider than it is today. Aliana says the mountainous nature of mainland Greece, especially in the north, allowed different regions to become somewhat isolated. Yeah, Greece is a fairly mountainous area, and so Greece is a fairly mountainous area, right? So there was some isolation that happened as well. The mountainous nature in Greece allowed regions to remain isolated and uncivilized. Yeah, so the uncivilized part is interesting because civilizations did develop in Greece, but not really based on intensive agriculture, at least not in the same way as other civilizations that we have studied. But some people were seen as uncivilized, and so you probably read in the textbook about how the people to the north, the Macedonians and the Thracians, they were seen as uncivilized, unsophisticated barbarians, right? And actually the word barbarian comes from what the Greeks thought the Macedonian language sounded like. So the Greeks thought this language sounded like bar 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 bar, and so they called them barbarians. And so it's a little bit of racism or prejudice in the past, but that's where the term comes from, barbarian. And so the Greeks thought that these people to the north were unsophisticated, uncivilized barbarians. Let's see. Where was I? Oh yeah, okay. Karen says it's mountainous, making it isolated and blocking it from enemies. Yeah. So Greece is, at least in the ancient world, Greece was a very difficult country to take over, either from inside or from outside, right? Because if you imagine if you have a country or a civilization or an area where it's reasonably flat, right? When the landscape is reasonably flat, you can just sort of line your army up and just march across it and take over whatever you encounter, right? It's very easy to sort of deal with flat areas. But Greece is very mountainous, right? And so it's difficult to get your army in there. It's difficult to line them up and maneuver them. And so as a result, the Greeks never really managed to unify themselves. And so no one king really manages to take over all of Greece the way we see it happen in ancient China. But also people coming from the outside find it hard to take over Greece as well. And so the Persians try a couple of times and fail. Sorry, Persians. They try a couple of times and fail. Alexander the Great will manage to do it. But in general, it is a difficult country to take over because it is so rocky and so mountainous. And so it allows these city-states to kind of develop on their own independently, but it also keeps the Greeks from being united under one ruler because it's so hard to take over the entire country. And so really what you see is not one king dominating Greece, but you see all those little independent city-states, all those poleis, and they kind of squabble and fight with each other quite a bit, but they really don't unify for the most part. And Pearlie says there's also the isthmus, right? And so that's a little narrow strip of land. It's controlled by Corinth, and it kind of separates mainland Greece, so the part that's connected to the southern part of Europe, to this other part of Greece, which is called the Peloponnese, right? So it's kind of a larger area that's connected just by this little bridge of land right by Corinth. Good. What sort of subsistence practices were people engaging in? So what were they doing to get food? What were the Greeks doing to get food? There's no such thing as skip the dishes. What did they do? did they do? Oh, so Casey says growing grains and barley instead of agriculture. Not quite, not quite. What the text is saying there, Casey, is that most of the places that grew crops in this part of the world would grow wheat and barley, but Greece is not a good place for agriculture because, again, it's really rocky, it's really mountainous, it doesn't have a lot of flat areas, it doesn't have a lot of river floodplains that are really good for growing that sort of stuff. And so actually they actually didn't grow much of either of those things because they just didn't have the landscape for it. Which again is another thing that makes Greece really interesting, is that it developed this civilization, but it develops it in a different way because all the other areas that we've talked about were river systems with floodplains where they grew wheat or barley, or in southern China they grew rice. All of those environmental contexts and subsistence practices are fairly similar, but here in Greece there's something else happening because, again, they don't have the land to practice a lot of wheat or barley growing. So Pearlie says agriculture, not so much, at least not in terms of wheat or barley, but they do herd things. So things like sheep and goats. It's a very good environment for herding sheep and goats, right? The sheep and goats can walk all through the mountains. They can eat all the green stuff that's growing between the rocks and things like that. And so lots of people herd sheep and herd goats. This is not necessarily how they get their food, Cindy, but they do. It is how they. It is something they are engaged in, right? Which is making ceramic pots, which are pretty fancy. I'll show you some. So that's true. Yeah, they make wine. They go hunting. That's true too. So there's one more thing. There's one more big thing we're missing in terms of food. There's one more big thing we're missing in terms of subsistence. There it is. So Aliana says, yeah, olive trees. So the Greeks become famous for their olives and their olive oil. Okay, so olive trees grow really well in this climate and in this part of the world, and the Greeks cultivate these olives. They grow olive. They have orchards of olive trees. They collect the olives. They eat them. They press them into oil. They use the oil for eating and for cooking and for, keeping their skin nice and soft. They sell it and trade it all around the ancient world, and it becomes very popular. And so the olive is a very important part of Greek subsistence. So other civilizations are using sort of wheat and barley. For the Greeks, it's olives and olive oil. Noisy people. The other thing that doesn't show up here and probably should be mentioned is fish, right? Because Greece is surrounded by the sea. It's surrounded by the water. And so the Greeks will fish for actual fish, for shellfish, for, squids and things like that. And they'll eat all of that stuff as well. So the sea is a very important part of their subsistence practice as well, right? And finally, last question for you. What raw materials does Greece have? So what kind of things does it have to build its civilization and its tools and to trade with other cultures? What does it have? What does it have? Okay, so Karen says marble. Good. Okay. I don't I don't know if they mentioned that in the book. Maybe they did, but that's okay, because marble is an important resource that the Greeks have, and they use it for. They use a lot of it for building. They use it for sculpture. So marble is certainly an important part of what the Greeks have. They do have silver, right? There will be an important part of this story where, spoiler alert, the Athenians will discover a huge vein of silver in their territory, and so that'll basically be like winning the lottery for them. They'll be super rich. So they do have some silver, and that'll become important in the story later. Overall, yeah, they didn't have a whole ton of metal, right? So they did have to trade for. Um, they did have to trade for the metal that they needed. What else did they have? Other raw materials. Other raw materials. So the marble is good. The silver is good. There's another important one as well. Maybe not so much the soil, but definitely the clay. Definitely the clay. So Athenians become very good at making ceramics, and so ceramics will be an important part of their daily life. Right? They'll eat out of their ceramics. They'll drink out of their ceramics, but they'll also use those ceramics to export things as well. And so all of that olive oil that they make, they'll put it in their ceramic pots, and they will sell those ceramics around the Mediterranean. And it'll actually make Greece, and it'll make Athens in particular very, very wealthy, even though the ceramic pots are not, at the time, they're just pots. That's all they are. Later, of course, now they're priceless artifacts. But at the time, they were, they were just regular pots. So yeah, they have a little bit of metal, but not very much. They do the Athenians find a silver vein, which is very important to them. They've got lots of clay. They've got lots of olives to trade. Lots of fish as well. They do lots of fishing. They do herding of sheep and goats. And again, they live in this very mountainous country that's next to the sea, with lots of little islands dotted throughout their territory. Okay? So that's kind of the general environment in which the Greek civilization will appear. Okay? Whew. So, okay, that's a good start. Let's take a little break. We'll come back in 10 minutes, and then we will look at just some broad phases of Greek history, just so we understand how things will play out. Okay, so take a little break, come back in 10, and we'll do that. Okay. Okay, and we're back. So let's acquaint ourselves with the world of ancient Greece, and we've started doing that already. Okay, so as you just told me, um, the Greek world is not just the Greece that we know today, right? It was actually a much larger area of the Mediterranean that was populated with lots of Greek city-states or polis, right? So here's a map that you have from your textbook, and as you can see, there are little Greek city-states all the way around the Aegean, right? Mostly next to the water. And of course, that's important, right? Because the Greeks are going to make their living from the sea. They're going to fish in it, but they're also going to construct boats and move around the Aegean and the Mediterranean and trade with other city-states, right? So you can see there's all kinds of little city-states scattered around the Aegean Sea. I think it's Herodotus, the famous Greek historian. Herodotus says that the Greeks were scattered around the Mediterranean like frogs around a pond, and so you can imagine all these little city-states as little frogs around the pond of the Aegean Sea. But anyway, you can see quite a number of Greek city-states, both in what's now Greece, but also now in what's Eastern Europe, in what is now Turkey. All of these little city-states were part of the Greek world in antiquity. You can also see some of the broad regions of Greece, right? So there's you can see the Peloponnese there in the bottom, which is kind of in blue. In gray, you can see sort of the sort of mainland Greece area. In the north, you can see Macedonia. Macedonia will become important a little bit later in Greek history because that's where Alexander the Great will come from. So the Macedonians will, spoiler alert, will eventually conquer Greece, but not yet. We see up to the northeast there's Thrace, so the Thracians live there. And of course, the Macedonians and the Thracians were kind of looked down upon by the Greeks. They thought they weren't civilized. They were a bunch of barbarians. And then, of course, there is the Persian Empire here, what's called Asia Minor. And so that sort of west coast of what's now Turkey, that was all called Asia Minor. And of course, it was under the control of the Persian Empire. The Persians will enter this story very shortly, so don't forget about them. So the Greek world is a little bit different in the past than it is today, but we have lots of city-states scattered all around the Aegean that were all a little bit unique, all a little bit different, and were kind of trading with each other and communicating with each other in various ways. The other thing I should mention before we move on here is the island of Crete, which you see at the bottom of the screen there. And that's one of the first places where a Greek civilization will occur, interestingly enough, is on the island of Crete. Okay, so you told me that the geography and the topography of the Greek mainland and the Mediterranean was important to the development of Greece for a few reasons, right? Number one, it was very mountainous, and so that allowed Greek city-states to be isolated and kind of develop into their own unique culture and political system, but it also kept anyone from taking over the whole of Greece for the most part. And so individual Greek city-states were usually unable to conquer other ones, and people from the outside, like the Persians, they had a tough time conquering Greece as well. So it was kind of the geography and the topography of Greece meant that it just made it difficult for anyone to dominate the entire area. So here's some pictures just to give you a little idea of what Greece is like. So you can see some pretty cool ruins of a ancient Greek building, perhaps a temple. To be honest, I'm not sure exactly where in Greece this is, but you can get a feeling for how sort of bumpy and rocky Greece is, right? Here's this might be a temple of an oracle or something, but I'm not positive. Again, I'm not sure exactly where in Greece this is, but you can see how, even if you don't know that much about farming, you can see how impossible it would be to farm in an environment like this, right? It's just not suited for large-scale agriculture. This is Athens, or a part of Athens, and as what you can see in the main part of the picture there is the Acropolis. And so acro is Greek for high, and polis is the city-state. So this is the high city, the high part of the city. And on the Acropolis, which you can still go to because this is a modern picture, on the Acropolis you can go to the Parthenon, which was constructed during the classical period of Athens. And what you can see, the big building there that you see in the middle, is what's left, I believe, of the Temple of Athena on the Acropolis in Athens. But we'll get to that a little bit later. Yeah, so you can see lots of Greek city-states were located next to or close to the sea. Again, you can see the landscape is very kind of bumpy and scrubby and rocky and not really good for growing food. And then, it's actually quite beautiful, right? There's lots of Greek islands scattered throughout the Aegean that look kind of roughly like this, kind of a place that you might want to go on vacation, right? Yeah, so quite beautiful. We said resources. The Greek mainland wasn't really suitable for agriculture. They herded sheep, they herded goats, they grew lots of olive trees and used the olives to eat, but they also used olive oil for various purposes, and they exported it as well. They traded it and made lots and lots of money at it. We said that the clay, the soil in around Athens and around Corinth particularly, was quite good for ceramics, and so we saw the Greeks manufactured and traded lots of ceramics as well. There's a couple of major types that you might see. One is called black figure pottery, and one is called red figure pottery. And so we don't need to know too much in terms of detail. So here's a piece of pottery from Athens, I believe, and it's black figure. And so you can see that the figures themselves are colored black. This is a famous scene from the Iliad, actually, where I'm going to forget her name now, where Achilles is killing in battle. What's her name? Penthesilea, that's her name. She's an Amazon, and so it's this classic story in the Iliad where Penthesilea, an Amazon, faces off against the Greek hero Achilles, and they fight really hard with their swords, and Achilles knocks off Penthesilea's helmet and stabs her, and at the moment he stabs her, he looks into her eyes and falls in love with her just as he kills her. Ugh, tragic, right? But here it is, kind of the story played out on a black figure pot. There's also red figure pottery that comes a little bit later, and we have quite a few instances of these types of pots as well. And so here's a red figure pot. This is a Greek myth that's playing out here. The woman you see on the left is Artemis. She's the goddess of the forest and of the hunt. And an Actaeon, this young man you see being devoured by dogs, is Actaeon, and there's a myth that we may explore a little bit later that has to do with that. And so we have lots of examples of these two different types of Greek pots, the red figure and the black figure. And as you can see, they're both quite striking and quite beautiful. And the manufacture of these things is not very easy because of course, you have to have the right type of clay, and you have to sculpt them. And as you can see, these pots are expertly sculpted. But the firing of these ceramics is also very tricky as well. And so in order to get the colors to do this, right, in order to sort of get the colors to oxidize properly, you have to have the right temperature in the kiln, and you have to have the temperature at the right level for the right amount of time, and then you have to either introduce oxygen into the kiln or you have to block oxygen from going into the kiln, and you have to do all this without any types of thermometers or clocks. So it's a really delicate skill in terms of adding air or removing air or cranking up the temperature, keeping track of the time. It's really not an easy thing to do even today. And so the Greeks were doing it without any sorts of thermometers or clocks or anything. And so it's really quite a skill to make pots like this. And you can see some of them are quite beautiful. Although in the ancient world, they wouldn't have been quite as valuable as they are now. Now, of course, you find them in museums and they're priceless. If you buy one on the open market, they are thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. But at the time, they were kind of just used to sell things. And so these might have been filled with olive oil, and they might have been sold to people in the marketplace. And the pot was just a pot, which is hard to imagine because they're quite beautiful. And so we said in terms of other resources, the Greeks didn't have much in the way of precious metals, although there was some silver that was discovered in Athens that we'll get to a little bit later. Okay, so there's kind of 4 periods of Greek history that we'll talk about really quickly. And so there's Bronze Age Greece, which we won't spend very much time with. There's Dark Age or Archaic Greece that we'll talk about very briefly. There's the Classical Greece, which is the period everyone thinks of when they think of ancient Greece. They think of classical Greece. A lot of important things happen in that period. And then there's Hellenistic Greece. And Hellenistic Greece is a period after Alexander the Great takes over the Greek world and kind of evolves and changes at that point. So there's kind of 4 broad periods of history we're dealing with here. So Bronze Age Greece, of course, is characterized by the use of bronze, right? That's what makes it the Bronze Age. There's 2 kind of cultures that exist in this period, and I'll show you some pictures very shortly. There's a Minoan culture that seems to be centered on the island of Crete, starting around 2000 BCE. That's about the same time, incidentally, as the Shah dynasty seemed to have been appearing, or the Shang dynasty seems to have been appearing in China. And then a little bit later, we see a Mycenaean culture appearing on mainland Greece. And so the Minoans and the Mycenaeans were both civilizations with centralized political systems. They both had a writing system, but their writing system was different. So there's these 2 cultures. I'll show you those in a second. After the Bronze Age, we enter into a Dark Age period. And so it's not entirely clear what happens, and it's not entirely clear why this Dark Age starts, but it's very similar to what happens in the Indus River Valley civilization, where people are kind of growing their crops and living in a centralized city, and they're writing things down, even though we couldn't read those things. And then eventually people kind of abandon the cities and disappear into the hillsides. And so that kind of happens here in ancient Greece as well. Starting around 1100 BCE, these Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations kind of collapse. People seem to decentralize and disappear into the hills. They stop writing things down. And so it seems to be a period of sort of economic and political decentralization, but it's also a period that we don't know much about because, again, people aren't writing anything down, and we know how important writing is for historians and archaeologists, right? There's an archaic period that happens after, and so in this archaic period, people start to write things down again and city-states, polis, start to appear. The ancient Greek language as we currently know it. Oh, come on, dog. The ancient Greek language as we currently know it comes from this period. Again, there's this classical period, which is the ancient Greece that most people think of, and which most of the important cultural and intellectual developments come out of Athens. Also pay attention to the fact here that this is really a period of about 150 years only. So classical Greece is a very short period of time, but a lot happens and a lot of important cultural and political and philosophical developments come out of this very short period, which is really quite amazing, but we'll get to that. And then, of course, there's the Hellenistic period where Alexander the Great conquers Greece and the Near East and Egypt and sort of turns it into a giant empire. And that will change the character of Greece forever because they're united under one ruler, kind of for the first time. Yeah, so here's how these periods kind of show up in graphic form. There is this earlier Cycladic civilization, which we won't really talk about. We'll just deal with the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. And so you can see the Minoans and the Mycenaeans here are in the Bronze Age. They're anywhere from about 1,000 to 3,000 years BC. And then, of course, archaic and classical and Hellenistic Greece will come a little bit later. And then after Hellenistic Greece, once Greece is Hellenized, or once it's brought under the control of Alexander the Great, it sort of ceases to become an important power in the Mediterranean. And eventually the Romans will start to rise a little bit later. And you can see the Romans appearing, starting around 146 BC. Yeah, okay. So, what should we know about Bronze Age Greece? Well, Bronze Age Greece is basically the tale of two civilizations. There's the Minoans, who, like I said, are living on the island of Crete, and the Mycenaeans that are living kind of on the mainland here and in the Peloponnese, okay? Now, the Minoans are older, and most of what we know about them are from archaeological sites that are found on the island of Crete. They seem to have had palaces that looked roughly like this. You can see sort of the sort of stereotypical Greek architecture, I guess. They were, oh yeah, this is kind of what it looks like today. They were palace economies. And so what seems to have been happening, little artist drawing here, what seems to have been happening is that people were growing olives, growing fruits and vegetables, maybe growing a little bit of grain, harvesting fish from the sea, and they were storing all these things in the central palace. Okay, so they were bringing all of their agricultural produce to the palace, to the ruler, the king, if you will, and then the king would hand out that food to people who needed it when they needed it. And so there was some sort of centralized political and economic control happening on Crete thousands of years ago. But unfortunately, we don't know very much about exactly what was going on. And the reason we don't know is because even though they were writing things down, we can't read their writing again. So it's a very similar situation to the Indus River Valley civilization where something was happening, right? We had the construction of urban centers and palaces, and we had some evidence of centralized political and economic control, but we don't really know what was going on or who was in charge because we can't read what was written, right? So we have archaeological remains that kind of look like this. We assume that these palaces would have looked something like this thousands of years ago, which is pretty impressive, I think. This is an example of some Minoan writing, Linear A. Again, we don't know how to read this. We don't know what it says. And it's not really connected to the ancient Greek script that comes later. So Again, unfortunately, we just don't really know what's going on here. The Minoans do have a lot of art that is preserved. And so in some of their palaces, we see frescoes, we see paintings that are done right on the walls. And so here we can see two young boys who are in a boxing match. And so we see some interesting hairstyles maybe. And they just have loincloths on and they're boxing. Here we have a couple of men and a woman. We're not really sure what's going on, if maybe it's a marriage or some sort of party or procession. A very different fashion choice for the woman that's different from the way most of our fashions are today. But similar to the ancient Egyptians, look at the different skin tones between men and women, right? Remember when we saw painted on the walls of tombs, we saw that men were often painted a darker color than women, indicating that men were kind of the ones outside in the fields working, and women were generally doing things that were indoors. And so men got a lot more sun than women did, and so men were a lot more tanned than women were. And so here you can see very clear evidence of that, right? This woman is very, very light-skinned, and these guys are very, very dark-skinned. But that probably doesn't have anything to do with what their skin tone was. I think it had to do with their roles inside or outside the home. The Minoans have lots of nature scenes as well. They seem to have loved nature, and so here we have some monkeys playing around, right? Very, very natural, very fun-looking. Here we have some dolphins and some fish painted on the walls in a mosaic or a fresco. I'm not really sure. Quite beautiful, quite interesting. The Minoans also seem to have had a thing for bulls. And so we're not really sure if the bull was sacred in some way or if it was symbolic of something. But there's lots of bulls that have been drawn and sculpted and uncovered from this civilization. And there seems to have been this crazy sport. And what you see happening here, I think, is kind of like modern bullfighting, except when the bull charges, instead of stepping out of the way with a red cape, like you see matadors doing in Spain, you actually jumped over the bull, if you can believe this. So this person here in the middle, who you can see with kind of darker skin, he's kind of like vaulting over the bull. So if you can imagine, the bull is running like this, and the person runs at the bull, and then they sort of plant their hands on the bull and flip over the back of them. That appears to be what's happening here. This is the craziest and most dangerous sport I've ever heard of, but it seems to have been happening here in Minoan Crete. You can see it on this wall, which is totally insane, but it looks like they were into it. Here's another Cretan sculpture, right, of a bull. Again, there seems to have been some cultural significance to the bull. And we also see the bull represented here. And so in the Greek myth of Theseus and the Minotaur, which we might go into a little bit later if we have time, the Minotaur is imagined as a half-man, half-bull creature that devours people. And Theseus is the hero who kills this monster, kills the Minotaur. And the Minotaur is said to inhabit a maze, a labyrinth, on the island of Crete. And so there's a later Greek myth that's connected to this island and this culture and their sort of fondness for bulls, whatever symbolically the bull meant. Now, the Mycenaeans were a little bit different. The Mycenaeans were found on the mainland. They also created huge palaces, and so this is, I believe this is Mycenae, the city of Mycenae, and so you can see it built up on a hill, which is very strategically desirable. It's very defensible to be on top of a hill. You can see the city is surrounded by walls, and there's streets and buildings inside. Some of the stones that these cities are built from are absolutely massive. So big, in fact, that the Greeks that came later, they thought that these cities were created by giants. They thought they were mythical beings had created these cities because the blocks were so big. How could they possibly have been lifted? How could they have been lifted into this arrangement? So really big stones, but amazing, amazing construction. There's these two sculpted lions here. We're not really sure what that means. And here's a kind of an artist's reconstruction of what Mycenae might have looked like. Yeah, and another one too. So the Mycenaeans had a script that was written as well. So this is what they call Linear B, which I believe we can read. Again, it's not really connected to later ancient Greek, but it's a different script. And so we can read, as far as I'm aware, the Mycenaean script, but not the Minoan one. And the other thing that comes out of the Mycenaean culture, which is pretty interesting, is these golden masks. And so the Mycenaeans would bury their men, probably their high status men, with lots of weapons, with lots of gold, and wearing these gold masks. And so this mask is a very famous example. It's called the death mask of Agamemnon. Agamemnon is a king in the Iliad, the classic Greek story. Even though this is called the Mask of Agamemnon, it almost certainly is not. It doesn't belong to Agamemnon, but that's just what they called it at the time. But we do find lots of these gold masks covering the faces of prominent men in the Mycenaean period. So we're not really sure what happens to end the Bronze Age period. So we have these two civilizations in the past, the Mycenaeans and the Minoans. The Minoans come first, and then the Mycenaeans come later. It seems as if the Minoans take over the Mycenaeans at some point. The Minoans start, at a certain point in history, the Minoans start writing in the Mycenaean script, in the Mycenaean language. And so that sort of implies to archaeologists that the Mycenaeans took control of the Minoans. But toward the end of this period, everybody kind of abandons the cities. Everybody goes off into the hillsides and does their own thing. Nobody writes anything down anymore. The written language of Linear A and Linear B seems to have been forgotten at this time. And so that's what brings us into the Dark Ages of Greece. And so again, we're not really sure what happens. There's not a lot of centralized political control, and things don't start, culture doesn't start to reappear in the archaeological record until the beginning of the Archaic period. Okay, and that's when we see people starting to write things down again. We see these new polis, these polises, starting to pop up around the Greek world. And we start to see evidence of Greek culture starting to develop again. Okay. And so one of the things that happens, and maybe this is the last thing I'll say today because we've had a fairly intensive day, but maybe one of the things that happens here is that there seems to be a feeling of something called Hellas or Hellenism. Okay, so in about the 8th century BC and around the 900 BCE, there seems to be evidence of this feeling that all of the Greeks are united within a broad culture. And so they see themselves as belonging to some kind of a Greek tradition. Okay, and so we said even though all of these different polises are scattered all around the Mediterranean, and they're all, unique in their own ways, they all have their own political organization and their patron god. They're all unique, but they all saw themselves as part of a bigger Greek culture. And that was called Hellas at the time. And so there's this thing called Hellenism. They all the Greeks saw themselves as Hellenes. They saw themselves as belonging, as being one people, even though they all lived in different polis, even though they were all a little bit different. They saw themselves as belonging to one culture, one group. And so one of the places that we see this show up is the first Olympic Games in 776 BC. And so the first Olympic Games take place at the foot of Mount Olympia. They are part of a festival to honor Zeus, the sky god. And so at the first Olympic Games, people from any Greek city-state can come and compete in a number of different sports. And if they win, they get a crown of olive branches, and they get to brag to everyone else that they are champions at the Olympic Games. There's no medals at this point. Nobody gets a gold or a silver or a bronze. You get bragging rights, basically. But the first Olympic Games happened there in 776 BC, and again, they are a pan-Hellenic event, right? People from all throughout the Greek world travel to Mount Olympus to compete in the games, right? One of the other things that ties the Greeks together in this period are two very important works of literature, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so historians think that these two stories, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are stories that had been passed down for quite some time before someone actually wrote them down in the 8th century. They are attributed to Hesiod, who may have written them down but didn't actually create the stories. The stories were probably passed down, orally for quite some time beforehand. And if you're familiar with these stories, I don't know if you are, the Iliad tells the story of the Trojan War. And so for a number of reasons, which I don't know if we'll get into, but the Greeks leave Mycenaean Greece and they go to Troy, and they lay siege to the city of Troy until they finally succeed. And then there's the Odyssey that follows one Greek general, Odysseus, follows him as he tries to return home to Greece. And so both of these are very early works of literature for the Western world, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And they're very important for the Greeks as well, because these stories would have been told all throughout the Greek world. Everybody would have known them, and everybody would have sort of taken lessons from them as well. And so, again, during archaic Greece, there starts to be this feeling throughout the Greek world that, we are one people, the Hellenes. They're competing in the Olympic Games where everyone is kind of invited. And of course, they share these sort of epic stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they're told throughout the Greek world. Let me just see. Let me just see what else I have here. Yeah, okay. Right. Okay, this is the last thing I'll say today. So, again, these city-states were kind of united. They felt like they were part of a bigger pan-Hellenic culture. But they were also very different. And one of the ways that these city-states, that these polis differed, was in their type of political organization. And we generally had three types of political organization happening in the Greek world. Okay? And so we talked about that. There were monarchies, there were oligarchies, and there were democracies. Okay? And sometimes there was a bit of a mix of these things happening as well. So monarchy, as we've already talked about, is a form of government where we have a single group or an individual. Mostly it's not a group. Mostly it's an individual that has power. Okay? And so we saw that in many cases in Mesopotamia. We saw Mesopotamian kings. We saw Egyptian pharaohs. In India, we saw Indian emperors arise, like Chandragupta Maurya and Ashoka. In China, we saw numerous Chinese kings and emperors appearing in various dynasties. And so we have monarchies occurring in the Greek world as well. And one of the places where this shows up is Macedonia. And so the Macedonians are to the north of Greece. They are generally under a monarchy, okay? But there were kings throughout the Greek world as well. Another form of political organization we see is oligarchy. And so oligarchies are political systems where the power rests with a small group of people, okay? And so this small group of people might be the nobility, they might be people who are the richest, they might be certain families, they might be the smartest people in society, it might be a religious group, but either way, an oligarchy is where you are ruled by a small group of people, okay? And as we'll see in a little bit, Sparta is a good example of this. Sparta is oligarchic, so they're ruled by a small council of people. And then finally, there's democracy. And democracy, as probably most of us know, is a system of government where the people, the citizens, have the power, and they tend to express that power through voting. And so they actually vote on things directly, or they elect people to vote on their behalf. And of course, Athens is the famous example of Greek democracy. Although other Greek city-states had elements of democracy as well. Athens is certainly the most popular. Whew, okay. That was a lot for one day, but I think we did learn a little bit about the Greek world and what the sort of Greek geography and topography was and how it influenced their history. We've learned the major periods of history: the Bronze Age, the Dark Age, archaic Greece, classical Greece, and Hellenistic Greece. And we've talked a little bit about what the Bronze Age was like and how it leads into other periods. So I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and we've got a good sort of background basis to talk about things moving forward. And so tomorrow we'll start looking a little more. Tomorrow we'll look a little bit at Greek religion, and then we'll move on to the story of Athens, because the story of Athens is very much the story of kind of classical Greece. Athens will become one of the most powerful city-states, one of the most powerful polis in the Greek world, and their conflict with Sparta will be kind of a major historical event in that period, but we'll get to that. My voice seems to be wearing out. I don't know why. Okay, so questions. Does anyone have any questions for me? Does anyone have any questions for me? Let's see. So let's see. So Cindy says no. Sam says no. Karen is all right. Pika says no. Casey says no. Siobhan is clear. Other questions? Okay, so if not, Jimmy's good. Oh, I see a question, Aliana. Are we going to learn about the Greek gods like Zeus? Yes, tomorrow. Yes, we are, Pearly. We're going to learn about that. No, I'm kidding. I know what you meant. Rashid is good. Adalbert is good. Okay. Greek god is so cool. Which one? There are many. Many, many, many. We'll only deal with a handful of them, though. There's a lot. Ying is good, okay. Min is good, that's all right. Jenna's thumbs up, that's good. Okay, so tomorrow, Greek religion and Greek gods, and then moving into the story of Athens, how they become a major power, how they develop democracy, how they pick a fight with Sparta, and then how they lose it all. Tragic, but we'll get to it. Okay, so I'll leave it there for today, and then I hope everyone has a nice afternoon, and I'll see you tomorrow. Okay, so bye.